Tomadelia, Chinor Comsecang Cholia, Kujangu into Puni, Teri Delia, Pebe, Teri de Pebe, Europe Chitu, Gomo, Today, Gasula Chotang, Taganashingi, Swistan, Liechtenstein, Puri, Sopa, Sokzo, Sokshu, Gule, Tumi number, Taganashingi, Shumde Maimba, Sopa Kagi, Tumi number Tang. Mixegi, Go Tunsur Chisur Cho, Ani Mimal Henge Yonglia, Tomadilia, Samdi, Dustile Shubada, Jani, Teringi, Geji, Domi, Topang, Nimodelia, number to Henge, Tangmolo, Simshu Ranchine, Namshipe, Haleba Tangbudude, Yimbine, number to Henge, Tangmolo de Pesha, Gabushida Chungso, Toji Cheshuya in Ruba. Taganashingi, Mixegi. Shunge zu Mangbuchik Pesha, Dilel Haga, Pugu Chungju, Pe Mangbu Pesha, Dende Pama Zugi, Simshudi, Da Mikpetensechik, Chadeba, Dauchik Tongudo, Dima Tebe, Koran zu Maumba, Pögi, Sönza Indugalia, Pögi Tapzodi, Mutuni, Nanzugi, Ne Dego Yoga Indugalia, number Zungugi, Simshudi, Dende. Puguzugi, Siorella, Kuranzu Yimbine, Maumbalia, Tapsudigalia, Dende Shugagre Sambegi, Rewachik Tongsu, Toji Cheshuain. Tande Chalia, Penanglia, Domi Tobdanginida, Zatakbagi, Tuzuchigre, Nieja number to be see share, Penanglia, Zawegita, Yamitsugi, Yimbata, Yimbine. Peba Mangbuchi Gingham Shubnangni, Mixegi, zero COVID policy Galia, Muge, Ha Labor Shubchumbuchik Nangbare. Taganashingi, Mutuni, Penangla Yobe, Penizugi, Rewadi, Tenjonali Yobe, Manzulia, Josha Yudogalia, Manzumene, Tende, Chigne, Garanzugi Tapzulia, Gapgure, Nine, Koranzulie, Tende Chinganzu Yoda, Shebegi, Dalenchik Chadugudu. Sumba Kechedi, Naranzugi Yimbine, Tensu Yangsu, Tangoya di Kechembuchaki Dugalia, number 2 Ha Labor Mangbu Pesha, Dilia Tende, Tojiche, da Jesu Iran Shuain, Antine, then Ingenalia Tikashechik Shuchogocho. Honorable Member of the Parliament, Kumo Tuden Gyatulang, the President, Vice President, Executive Committee members and section leaders of the Tibetan Association of Switzerland and Liechtenstein, the former representatives, former parliamentary members, heads of the various Tibetan organizations, and of course, dear Tibetans and all the supporters of the Tibetan movement. It gives me immense pleasure to see that even after 60 odd years of this Tibetan movement, we continue to see Tibetans and Tibetan supporters raising Tibetan issue and importantly trying to resolve the Tibet-China conflict. I think today, on this 74th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, and of course the observance of the International Human Rights Day, we have to remember the deteriorating situation inside Tibet. What we have seen time and again is not just one particular violation of Tibetan human rights. It is systematic and strategic violation of every facet of human rights of Tibetans inside Tibet. What we have seen is not just protest against the zero COVID policy of China implemented with the sole purpose of controlling the Tibetan people in Tibet, but also rejection of the Chinese policy of assimilation, of destroying the Tibetan identity, culture, religion, and every important aspect of Tibetan life. I think on this day, it is not just important to celebrate the declaration, but also to reflect what this declaration has actually brought to the Tibetan people. I, for one, sincerely believe that there is much more ground to be covered by the United Nations when it comes to the human rights of Tibetans in Tibet. We have seen that Tibetan cultural identity is being persecuted. And this is not just aimed at the current generation. This is aimed at decades to come, because what this colonial style boarding school of the Chinese authorities is targeted towards is not just the current generation but the generations to come. Because it is not just 10-year-old and 15-year-old Tibetan kids that are being sent to these boarding schools, but also kids as young as 3 years old, 4 years old are being forcefully separated from their Tibetan family and are being sent to these boarding schools. And what do they do in these boarding schools? They teach what it means to be Chinese, and of course, definitely not in Tibetan but in Chinese language. And this is bringing about a fundamental shift in the Tibetan people's identity, because Tibetan children are no longer being able to preserve what it means to be a Tibetan. And I think this definitely will have impact on a large scale in generations to come. On the other matter, what we are seeing is total surveillance of Tibetans inside Tibet. We are receiving reports of DNA collection from millions of Tibetans, thousands of Tibetans, and these databases are being used to control Tibetans, to monitor Tibetans, and to ensure that tomorrow they cannot step outside of Tibet. We already had curtailment in the movement of Tibetans. They are not allowed to even move within Tibet freely. And now in future, with the extensive DNA collection, and now we are also receiving reports of iris scan, their eye is being scanned and the database is being built, and these are all aimed to control Tibetans in Tibet in the future. Also, what we are seeing is the destruction of the monasteries, the destruction of religious institutions. And for Tibetans, it is the culture, it is the language, it is the Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, that has always been the unifying factor. And with these systematic attack on Tibetans and their core identity, what we fear is that there is a great threat to the civilization of Tibetans, which has been centuries old and which has been preserved against very difficult odds in Tibet. With this, I would like to sincerely thank all the supporters of Tibet, because with your support, I definitely feel that there will be a sustainable movement of the Tibetan cause, and maybe one day we will hopefully be able to gather together in front of Potala and pray for the long life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Thank you so much.